No, we weren't surprised. We were certainly disappointed. We just got back from China, and certainly every meeting we had in China with our buyers and customers, there was clearly some preparation for the potential for a disruption in the markets between China and the U.S. And so, not surprised, disappointed. This thing will have legs that's going to last longer than some of us want, and we'll just have to see what happens in the marketplace.
Is it an easy resolution, a tough resolution? Can you see, if you look into your crystal ball, can you see what's going to happen?
I really struggle with that question. I think, again, as I said, the uncertainty is what really is so troubling. It's going to trouble the marketplace. Yeah, you can envision a way for China to save face and make some concessions on intellectual property, look at some changes in the way that they purchase technology and what they require of companies going to China to do business and the requirements of ownership. You can see that happening. You can see a potential for the president to gain in those areas, President Trump, and say, you know, we've made some progress, we're going to continue to make progress. But the lack of details and lack of uncertainty is really troubling. And again, this administration is not very predictable at times, and we've seen that in many areas. In my opinion, this is a very high-risk strategy. When we talked to Ambassador Branstad when we were in China this last time, we talked about these issues. And he reminded us that the issues between China and the U.S. are not new. The Obama administration had concerns, the Clinton administrations had concerns, the Bush administrations. This president has decided to be more aggressive. And again, this is a higher risk strategy. And so, again, the fact these aren't new issues, I think there are ways to resolve it, but it's going to have to be in a way that saves face for the Chinese, as they would call it, and it's going to have to give the president some win. Let's hope they find that solution.
A large portion, more than half of U.S. soybeans go to China. Mm-hmm. Is this one of those things where they're still going to have to get their beans from us no matter what, and we're sort of stuck here? What's happening?
Yeah. Well, we again, I think there's the short-term implications and the long-term. Short-term implications, there are only so many soybeans available in the world, and the U.S. has the largest carryover of any country in the world, and so they're not going to be able to completely eliminate the purchase of U.S. soybeans, but there are estimates out there that we can talk about that would say it's going to be a fairly dramatic short-term impact on the soybeans. They're already paying some premium for Brazilian soybeans. They'll continue to do that at some level. The beans that Brazil was selling to other countries, somebody's got to fill that demand as well, and so there will be opportunities for the U.S. now to perhaps fill a market that Brazil had, but now all that China can get is going to come from Brazil, so there will be opportunities. But long term, there are two other concerns I'm concerned about. One is the ability of the Brazilians, particularly, if they're particularly getting a premium from China, to plant more soybeans. They can bring into production lots more acres. The Chinese will invest billions and billions of dollars to continue to accelerate infrastructure developments in Brazil. So you got those kind of production issues. But the other issue I'm concerned about longer term is the potential for anti-Americanism to continue to grow. Again, I've been going to China for many years. It's certainly more prevalent now to see this anti-American mindset. And the Chinese have a history of getting into disputes with other countries, and it impacts the way consumers view the world. South Korea, Japan, when they've had disputes with them, South Korean cars have never regained market share after a dispute. And so, because you have a government in China that has absolute control over the media and social media for that matter, they can control the messaging. And you could see, I'm fearful, you could see some additional anti-Americanism show up. And so from an American brand standpoint, from McDonald's or others, you could see a groundswell potentially in China of anti-Americanism, just avoid U.S. products. From a soybean perspective, it's possible, even if we eliminate tariffs, counter tariffs, that you could see an edict or a directive from the Chinese government to these state-owned companies that you should buy U.S. soybeans only if you have to, and that there's a preferential purchase decision made of South America soybeans. It could be just simply you and I talking as government and buyer saying, hey, when you're buying soybeans, buy Brazilian whenever you can. It could be something more significant where there are actually non-tariff barriers to trade with the United States. So you suddenly began inspecting soybeans for an unapproved biotech event, a foreign matter, paperwork's not done correctly, and so you have these non-tariff barriers. So short term, it's going to be a disruption in the marketplace, certainly. Longer term could be increased production in South America. I'm also concerned about the growth and potential of anti-American sentiment in a country that's incredibly important to us from a soybean perspective.
Well, something that Aaron mentioned to us before we got started, it's not like they can just throw a switch and say, okay, we got beans ready for you. Mm-hmm. Is there a long-term potential for China to just take over the production of soybeans enough such that the U.S. is left out of the equation completely?
Yeah, there's no opportunity for China to replace imported soybeans. They just don't have the land mass. They don't have the capacity to grow it. China today grows less soybeans as a country than we do in the state of Iowa. So it's not likely to see a major increase. They are going to certainly, and they just announced this week that they're going to increase subsidies for domestic production of soybeans. But again, it's just a very limited place in China currently where they can grow, and it's all in the Northeast. It's got to compete with corn. It's got to compete with higher value crops such as vegetables and fruit. The Chinese do not want to be dependent for imports of rice, for example. They don't want to have to import lots of fruit and vegetables. So the competition for land is so great, and the lack of really suitable land for soybeans is so limited. I don't think that's an option for the Chinese. The Chinese are going to have to invest, as they have been, in production facilities around the world. South America, Ukraine, there's some opportunities. So it's longer term, there's research going on about if we can grow soybeans in South America, there are places in Africa we could potentially do the same thing. So again, the Chinese are likely to continue to invest billions of dollars, trillions of dollars potentially in looking at places to diversify their sourcing. They made a decision, again, why we're now exporting so much of our soybean crop. The Chinese government made a decision years ago that they could not be self-sufficient in soybeans. They want to continue to be self-sufficient in corn and rice, as I mentioned, wheat, but they made a decision we can't be self-sufficient in all those things. And because soybeans are produced in the U.S., but also in places in South America, they at least had two sources, and they knew that they never wanted to be dependent on one source, whether that was from weather or for trade disputes. And so they have limited options, but there are options. And again, Brazil being the biggest. There are millions of acres that could be brought into production.
Is it something where eventually, just through non-tariff trade blocks, that the U.S. could be left holding the bag on soybeans? It's all of a sudden we've got so much, there's nowhere else in the world for us to sell it.
I think that's the worst case scenario, is where do we go with those soybeans? Purdue University did a study a couple of weeks ago, said, what would happen if we had a 30% tariff? I don't think they looked at 25%, but I think they looked at 30% tariff. My recollection of that Purdue study said they projected we'd have a 71% reduction in exports of U.S. soybeans to China, a 40% reduction overall, so there's about a 30% swing. So again, 70% loss to China, 40% overall, means about 30% would go someplace else. You would see a reduction certainly in the demand for soybean acres in the U.S. The challenge for American agriculture right now, particularly in the Midwest, coming in a year where soybeans are king, in the sense there will be more soybean acres than corn, is if you saw a reduction in the demand for soybeans and that there was a reduction of 10% or more of acres of soybeans, where would those acres go in the Midwest? The market clearly doesn't want more corn. There's plenty of corn right now as well. So what are the options for Iowa farmers? If soybean demand is down because of the disruption in international trade, corn doesn't need another 10% of acres, just to use a number, what would we plant? And again, on top of the financial challenges that Iowa farmers are dealing with right now, to have this potential disruption in the marketplace, again, whether that's short term in the markets we're seeing today or longer term in some of the scenarios we talked about before, this is really the last thing American farmers need right now, is uncertainty. And when you're dealing with lack of profitability, disruption in the market to this magnitude could be very devastating for many farmers.
Do you think that farmers are in a position now where they're going to have to pick? It's like a lot of them have already made their decisions, December, right, January.
Yep.
But are they in a position now where they could go, all right, soybeans just lost, 40 cents. do I swap now? Do I switch acres to corn? You know, is that an option, or is that not a really financially sound option?
Many farmers have already made the commitments on, fertilizer applications, those kinds of things. So they're not going to switch a significant number of acres. There could be some shift back and forth, but I think we have to keep in mind this will impact not only soybeans, but it's already impacting corn. It's impacting the pork industry. They have their own set of tariffs. Ethanol has their own set of tariffs. So it's not just going to be a soybean prices go down. This is going to be, corn prices are likely to fall as well. I don't know what the markets are doing currently, but you're going to see reduction in all of those things. And so as a farmer, then you're sitting here with very few good options. We're not going to leave most land in the U.S. Not planted. It's going to get planted to something. We're going to look at the crops and say, which one can I lose the least amount of money on, or what crop has the least amount of risk associated with it. So the farmers will be making those kind of decisions. I don't anticipate a major shift in this planting season based on the short term. Longer term, yeah, potentially. But again, if we don't have the Chinese market, if we don't have access to it the way we do today, we'll still have access, but it'll be more limited. What are we going to do with the soybeans, and what are we going to do with the corn? And that's really the danger, of the long-term danger, I believe, of getting into a trade war with in our case, our number one customer. It's just not sure where it ends up. Again, it's a very high-risk strategy. All of us are aware that there have been these issues with China. They certainly have issues related to intellectual property, the impact and the manipulation, if you will, of the marketplace by the Chinese. Those are real issues. So I don't dismiss those at all. But the question is whether this strategy, this kind of turning up the rhetoric and beginning to have the tariffs and counter tariffs, this is a very high-risk strategy. And my fear is that farmers will pay the price. I believe the Chinese government will take care of their industry and cover some of these costs. It's not clear to me at all who's going to cover these costs for Iowa farmers.
Which brings up two thoughts. The first is, with feed needs for hogs, cattle, how does this impact the soybean farmer? Because they're already, in that list were beef, and previous to that were certain elements of frozen pork.
Yes.
Now you've got lots of animals. We're 106% of placements from a year ago in cattle and 103% in hogs. Now all of a sudden you've got all sorts of stuff in the way of making a profit.
Right. It's troubling, to say the least, and that's why, again, we remain very pessimistic about this approach. It might work. It's certainly a high-risk strategy, as I said. The implications are huge, and they will cut across not only the commodities that we talk about, corn, soybeans, and pork and beef, but I think across the entire economy. So, the steel and aluminum tariffs and going to impact manufacturing and all kinds of technologies. And again, it's hard for many of us to understand how a trade war is going to be a positive thing. And again, I understand that there are issues between the United States and China. There have been for a long time. But this strategy is high risk. And the uncertainty because of the rhetoric, the positioning, the need for China to save face, the need for the administration to get a win as it relates to their politics. These are just really difficult issues that, again, I'm afraid, unfortunately, that American farmers are going to pay the biggest price.
Can you comment on whether or not you think this will be a swing in how the president is viewed? Because this is the base. American farmers were integral, rural America was integral in electing Trump. Is this, do you think, something that will swing that vote away?
Yeah. I'm not sure. I can tell you the Chinese asked the same question. And as I said, the Chinese are as good at looking at the red and blue map as any political analyst in the U.S. They're well aware of the implications. They look at the 8 or 10 states throughout the Midwest that have been swing states that supported President Obama, who shifted to support President Trump. They know that. They know all of the political strategies associated with that. So they're aware of it. As we've been having these conversations when we were in China, we've had members contact us who are extremely supportive. We've had other farmers say, hey, it's about time that somebody got tough with the Chinese. They've been taking advantage of Americans for a long time. If we have to pay the price short term to get tougher with the Chinese, then we're prepared to do so. So I think there's a mixed opinion, but I think, from my limited political experience and analysis, I think clearly there is growing concern among many who may have voted for President Trump that, maybe his rhetoric is what he meant. That maybe what he said, what he was going to try to do with the Chinese, NAFTA, Canada, Mexico, Korea, Japan, that rhetoric maybe was more on target than what we thought would be. And so I think I think there's an opportunity for there to be some erosion in support of the president over this policy, but I think it will cut both ways. Many of us were surprised in the outcome of the election, at least the magnitude of the victory for President Trump when you look at the number of states that he won. A lot of it had to do with the sentiment of many Americans and Iowans about the unfairness of trade as it is today. I can tell you, as somebody who works in the soybean industry and someone who believes in the power and the positive impact of trade and globalization, I'm concerned of the erosion of support among Americans and Iowans about trade and the positive role it's played in our economy in the state and the positive role it's played here in the U.S. And I think we all have a lot of work to do to reconnect with consumers and voters about, yes, there are downsides. There are winners and losers in every trade agreement, but there are winners. And sometimes I think we forget the fact that there are winners, and the U.S. is winning in some. I think those of us in agriculture, though, have a responsibility to understand that because a trade agreement might be good for agriculture, it's not necessarily good for folks in manufacturing and other industries. And I think we have to take a more holistic approach at trade agreements. I think that's the only way we're going to build a uniform or maybe a consensus approach to trade agreements in the U.S. We cannot become isolated. We have to sell our products around the world, but we have to do so in a way that's obviously good for the United States. And again, there have been cases where it's been an unbalance between the China and the U.S., and we do have to address that.
It appeared that if there's some sort of major trade war where these actually come to pass mid-May, that it's going to be on the backs of U.S. farmers and not so much on the back of U.S. manufacturers. That would be the headline from my perspective, but steel's involved in there too. But is it being balanced on the back of U.S. farmers?
Well, I think farmers are going to pay a disproportionate share of that burden, if you will. I think we are a very big target politically. We talked about the red and the blue map. They know that rural America generally voted for Trump, and so there's going to be, I think, Chinese clearly selected soybeans to send a message to the Trump administration. We know your politics. We know this will have impact on the people that voted for you. I don't think there's any doubt about it. So based on that, I think agriculture is going to pay perhaps a disproportionate share of the burden or the cost of this potential trade war. I don't think there's any doubt that that's going to occur, and the Chinese, in my opinion, are well aware of it. They were, again, in our conversations, they shared that, the impact. They know where the votes are in the presidential election that's coming up. I think they're well aware. And yes, farmers are going to pay a disproportionate share. I think it's clear.
This is a lot of screaming and yelling.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a background? I mean, are there people you think that are work in the background? It's like, okay, yes, everybody's talking really tough, but is it a point of where somebody blinks? Is there a point where reasonable or cooler heads prevail?
Let's hope so, and I think certainly have been indications. Again, when we met with Ambassador Branstad last week, he indicated those conversations were taking place, that he had certainly shared his concerns and observations about the impact. He indicated that the administration fully understood the possible impact. We had Secretary Perdue yesterday or the day before say that there might have to be some compensation or making farmers whole. What that means, I have no idea how we do that under WTO, but those kinds of things are out there. But yeah, you got to hope and you got to believe that they're out there. As you may recall, there was a high-level Chinese leadership team that came to D.C. Earlier in March, about the time Billy Graham passed away, and there was not the opportunity to have some of the high-level meetings. So it's certain way the media reported it in China. We sent a high-level delegation to the U.S. to have these discussions, and we didn't have them. And so that was reported that, again, maybe that was a snub by the United States. But clearly there are conversations taking place. If you look more broadly outside of trade, clearly, in my opinion, China has engaged with the U.S. in dealing with North Korea. Those conversations have taken place. In previous visits and visits with embassy staff, China has actually been a pretty good partner on global terrorism and has engaged with the United States and how do we deal with global terrorism. So based on that and based on the importance of this relationship, economically, politically, militarily, you know those conversations are taking place. Can there be a breakthrough? We hope so. And again, the Trump administration knows this, but they have to figure out a way for China to save face. And Trump also has to save face. And so, yeah, I hope so. I know the conversations are ongoing. At what level, I'm certainly not privy to.
Roberts, Senator Roberts, actually said in a meeting 2 weeks ago, to Lighthizer, he said, we don't know whether or not we're going to have to include in the Farm Bill payments, and he was calling them Trump tariff payments, TTPs.
Yep.
Is that a possibility, or is that a necessary thing that has to happen?
Yeah, I don't know how you make that work. I don't know, but I think it could be necessary. How do you do that under WTO and other ways without subsidizing farmers? We've been moving away from subsidies. There's virtually no subsidies today for soybeans. We certainly have crop insurance, but we don't have direct subsidies. How you would do that and stay compliant with WTO and a number of things, I don't know how that works. I'm hoping we don't get to that point, certainly. I don't think you're going to see that in the short term, but longer term, maybe. It's just too big of an unknown at this point. I mean, we can't even get a farm bill done this year. How are we going to add this complication to it by adding some kind of trade payment, if you will, or trade impacts? And again, we're not the only industry that's crying for help. There's lots of industries, and so if you do it for American farmers, are we going to have to do it for the airlines, the plane industry and other folks? It just gets really, really complicated. And again, at the end of the day, that's why I believe open and fair trade agreements are important, where we let the markets make some of these decisions. But again, politics always gets in the way. It is a real issue, and we're going to have to resolve these political issues before we can move forward. So.
What have I missed? We've talked about a lot. We talked about payments. We talked about how do they save face. That's going to be the big question. Is like they are not gonna go over. If they look like they're getting socked in the chops, they're not gonna.
I think you have to. And again, one of the advantages of going to China as many times as I had and over a period of time, I have seen and experienced this growing sense of China as a country. This nationalism. They hosted the Olympics. That was a major coming out, if you will, for China, and the implications of what that means for China pride and the China way, and making China great again, if you will, if you look at the Chinese history. So that kind of nationalism, which we talk about in the US, we talk about it in Europe, this growing sense of nationalism, it's real in China as well. And so, the fear I have here is that we perhaps underestimate the importance of this saving face, and that the Chinese are very proud people. They look longer term than we do. I mean, they've been around for thousands of years. We're just a baby in their minds when you think about history. And so they're willing to think longer term than we are. They don't have every 2-year elections. They now have a president for life. And so they have an ability to think longer term, project longer term, and when you combine that with this growing sense of nationalism. And so if you think about Chinese history, and I don't know if this matters to you, but if you think about Chinese history, there have been attempts over time for China to come together as a country. And then there was the 7 warring parties and all that stuff. Under the communist leadership, they brought the country back together. And I was there a month after the earthquake that killed 80,000 people. And I was there with Governor Culver. And we had an opportunity to go outside with this company we were visiting at the time. And we're standing out on the steps, and there are probably 100 Chinese employees of this company, with Governor Culver and our delegation standing there, and they attempted for the first time, and as far as I know, in the first time in Chinese history, to do a moment of silence to reflect the number of people that were killed in this earthquake. And that was a new event for the Chinese. And my point is, it is a reminder as they build this sense of nationalism and who they are as a people, combined with the Olympics, we better be very careful that we don't underestimate this nationalism that's swelling up. We have it here in the US. We shouldn't be surprised by it. We don't want Chinese to push us around. China is very, very, very set on not being pushed around by anybody again, because they have a history of being conquered, taken advantage of over a long period of time. and they think longer term than we do. And to me, again, as I said earlier, that's one of the dangers, I think, is the longer term impacts of the damage to the relationship between China and the U.S. is this anti-Americanism, which generally has not been there. They've actually been pretty positive about that long-term relationship. To me, that is a real danger that we have to be careful of.
Final question, and it has to do with what you might consider to be the mind of the Chinese consumer. Yes, you talk about anti-American sentiment, but in the grocery store, do you think that they act like U.S. Consumers do? They vote with their money, with their pocketbook.
Yeah.
If they see a cheaper U.S. product, do you think that that's going to be where their hard-earned cash is going to go? Versus, well, we have Chinese, for instance, pork, U.S. pork, and Chinese pork products.
Yeah, the impact of Western culture on China is growing a lot, and so U.S. products are rarely, if ever, a discounted product. They're almost always a premium product. So what you have is China wanting to move up in their economic status. They want to eat American beef. They want to eat American pork. They want to go to American brands. So there is that kind of desire for Western brands. So U.S. products are almost always a premium. But the thing we have to remember is that we're not the only premium product in the world. There are other premium products that the Chinese can. And so again, when you're talking about 1.4 billion people, 300 to 400 million of them at least are middle income, as they describe it. They have lots of choices today. If you go into a marketplace in China, at least the modern ones, you have the selection of all the Western products from around the world, and a great selection. And again, the Chinese that have the money want to move up into a higher quality for safety reasons, for status reasons, for taste. We do have an advantage. We have safe food, we have high quality food. The Chinese consumers, at least the middle income folks, want to buy that stuff. So, I think there will be that, but again, there are choices. And as I shared earlier, when you look at the car industry, there has been a definite reduction in the import of Japanese and South Korean cars by consumers, not necessarily because of the Chinese policies, but because consumers have said, if they don't respect us as a country, I don't want to buy their products. That's the thing that I worry about longer term, is that if we get into the situation of anti-Americanism, that can impact us. U.S. soybean farmers have been in China for 35 years, investing in relationships, investing in market development, investing in helping, 35 years ago, helping the Chinese understand how to use soybean meal in rations, really basic stuff. 35 years. I've been there a lot. There's a lot of relationships. Anti-Americanism, if it happens, will, I think, be potentially the longest term impact of this potential trade war. That's the one that worries me more than the short-term disruptions in the marketplace.